Welcome to another discussion session for the Department of International Relations' seminar series. My name is Ben Zala, and today I have with me James Pattison from the University of Manchester, so all the way from sunny UK.
Or less, not so much sunny UK.
Not so sunny. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So we've had you here you gave a paper on your new book project on the ethics of alternatives to war.
Yeah.
And so I thought I'd just start by asking you what brought you to this project. Why are you looking at not the ethics of war, but the ethics of alternatives to war, and what sort of alternatives are you looking at in the book?
Okay, thanks, Ben. So there's a lot written on the ethics of ethics of war. We've got a much better understanding of all the various issues stemming from just war theory. The issues are related to when we can go to war, so jus ad bellum, and what we can do during war. But the literature's on, and the understanding we have of thinking through economic sanctions, diplomacy, non-violent resistance, military assistance to rebels and other states, and other measures as well, such as positive incentives, are far less developed. So that was kind of the theoretical reason that prompted me. The second reason was that just in debates around Syria and debates around Ukraine as well, I found that there was a real paucity of understanding in actually the ethical issues surrounding all of the various measures that could be used if military intervention was not on the table.
Right.
So I was very motivated to think actually much more about all of these various issues that the alternatives raise.
Sure. And so across these different types of alternatives to war, you're looking at the different sort of ethical dilemmas that they throw up.
Yeah.
And on the whole, did you find lots of recurring themes and recurring moral issues, or were they quite issue-specific, quite contingent on the area?
So a bit of both.
Right.
So there are some that are recurrent, or the most obvious one is whether the measure is effective or not.
Right.
So that's an obvious one that occurs, and costs as well involved with those launching the measure and the costs for those that are receiving the measure. So those are recurrent themes, but then there are ones that some apply to some. Mm-hmm. So many of the measures face the problem that they do harm. In other words, that they harm fairly directly themselves. The most obvious one is economic sanctions, but other measures can do so as well. So certain forms of naming and shaming might still do harm. Some are a little bit more specific. So one of the particular issues about positive incentives, I think we might say a bit more about that later, is that they can reward those who act wrongly, so they can provide a benefit to those that don't deserve that. There's also, across the board, there's issues to do with fairness and the distribution of the costs involved with undertaking the measures.
Right.
Also other issues that kind of come up a few times, so hypocrisy. So for instance, naming and shaming, if that's hypocritical, is that a problem?
Right, yeah.
Also, another one I think is common to quite a few of the measures is the importance of how much should you engage in the measure in order to support the relevant global norms. So that arises when we're thinking about ICC prosecutions.
Yep.
Also arises with economic sanctions, and also arises when we're thinking about naming and shaming.
Sure. And so maybe let's pick up on this issue of positive incentives.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the aspect of the book that you really focused on in your presentation here at ANU. So tell us a little bit more about some of the ethical dilemmas that are thrown up. I mean, positive incentives instinctively feels less ethically problematic because it's less of a punishment. It's the carrot rather than the stick. So what are the sort of circumstances in which a positive incentive might do more harm than good?
Do more harm than good, yeah. So you're right. So it does, on the face of it, it seems great, and I am generally very supportive of the idea primarily because they're not coercive. So all of the problems to do with military intervention, economic sanctions as well, because they're coercive, you're not going to get that with positive incentives. Sure. There are a few issues though that they do raise. One I've already mentioned is this issue of rewarding injustice or rewarding bad behaviour. So you can think, if you're going to offer Assad some sort of positive incentive, is that rewarding the bad behaviour of the Assad regime?
Yeah.
That's one issue. Another issue is to do with the fact that you could have moral hazards. So various actors, say rebel groups, they might even take up arms, or they might, in theory, in principle at least, or they might engage in problematic behaviour in order to try and get this positive incentive. Sure. People know this can be on the table. I was also worried about extortion. So one worry is that if you're offering the incentive, the body that you're offering, the rebel group, for instance, that's taking the incentive, just might not change their behaviour. So they might take the recognition, or they might take the financial inducement but not actually shift what they're going to do.
Yeah, sure.
Now, it's very hard to say that there's very clear circumstances where those problems are definitely going to apply and not definitely going to apply. So to some degree it's contextual.
Right. Which makes it difficult, I guess, for policymakers, deciding when and where to apply these things.
Yeah, I think it is. It is. Although we do have some indication from some of the political science literature on when it's actually going to be more likely to be those problems are less likely to be serious,
sure,
and it's more likely to be effective. So we know, for instance, that issues to do with we know when we've got a very trusted body that's going to be offering the incentive, that's more likely to actually win the support of the potential receiver, and so it's more likely than it's actually going to work. We also know, or vice versa, that if there's an adversarial relationship between the potential incentive giver and those receiving the incentive, it's probably not likely to work.
Difficult.
Yeah.
So on that particular point, actually, I thought as a last question, given that there's such a focus at the moment on the whole role of economic sanctions, particularly on the North Korean regime relating to the nuclear weapons and missile program, the nuclear missile program. Given that you've looked at economic sanctions as one of the categories or one of the ideal types of alternatives to war, where do you sit on economic sanctions in terms of effectiveness, but also the ethical issues?
Yeah, so thank you. So I think economic sanctions get a bad rap, and to some degree rightly. Mm-hmm. There's been a move towards targeted or smart sanctions that's alleviated some of the problems, although those labels are exaggerated. I think they can be effective sometimes when we adopt a more realistic and less demanding conception of effectiveness that's not focused simply on achieving the policy goals of the sender. So, for instance, changing the behaviour of the target, which is very, very difficult. If we're focusing on something such as the intensity of the conflict or the severity or the duration of it, I think economic sanctions can have some positive effects on that. They, though, can still have lots of unintended negative consequences. And they can also face other problems as well, other moral problems, so deontological problems or intrinsic problems, if you like. Still, I think some of those are over-exaggerated. Right. So, I mean, my view tends to be that economic sanctions, I don't think we should worry about the fact that they sometimes suggested that they intend harm or they use the suffering of the population as a means to change behaviour. I'm not so worried about those. I don't think those are really serious objections. I think the key one, as I've already alluded to, is the negative humanitarian consequences.
Yeah, sure.
Those can arise quite significantly with smart sanctions. So one issue, for instance, is that smart sanctions can actually make it more difficult for smart sanctions on financial assets can make it more difficult for NGOs in the field to be able to receive banking services. Right. And that can have serious humanitarian impact. Yeah. Our understanding of all these sorts of issues is still fairly in its infancy. So, although I'm generally supportive of sanctions, and I think they're more effective than they're often painted, particularly in some of the older literature, I think we also should be very cautious in the resort to them. And the other measures that I look at are generally preferable.
Sounds like we need a good new book on this particular topic indeed. The book itself is forthcoming with Oxford University.
Yes, that's right,
out probably sometime next year.
Yeah, hopefully early next year. So springtime in the UK next year.
Fantastic. Sounds like it'll be on everyone's best books list for next year. Well, thanks again for coming in. Really appreciate it. And all the best.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.